When we look at the tale of the American democratic experience over the last 200 and some odd years, it's important for us to be aware that the ebbs and flows of American democracy and sort of what access has looked like has changed substantially in that period. The law, the saying that the arc of justice is long, is an important one to start to think about. However, when we look at American democracy, right, we know that those democratic principles and democratic ideals have been with the United States since its earliest days. It's the United States, we know, that is the first of these democratic revolutions that occurs in the 18th century. And it's important for us to be aware, right, that even though it's the first one of these revolutions, right, it is also important to note that it's not democratic initially. In fact, many people talk about, we'll talk about this on the next slide, how the revolution and the Constitution that follow are really conservative backlashes to this. Now, the French Revolution that is seen as probably the greatest example of the revolutions of this period, right, is often seen as an ominous, even dangerous, and certainly in some cases very radical revolution, right? The United States doesn't have that, right? And for the people who lived in the United States after the Revolution, right, so after the American Revolution, which ends in 1783, and then the establishment of the Constitution in the years after that, right, it's important to realize that sort of looking across the ocean to the French example was nerve-wracking, right? What they perceived as the failure of a revolution, right, or the destruction of property and sort of the ignoring of basic human rights that they supposedly espoused was really troubling for a lot of people. So as I say here, the Constitution was the American Constitution, that is an extremely conservative document. It preserves a lot of the rights that people generally had already, but it also preserves a lack of access to voting for a lot of people, right? Only 1/4 of the eligible white males were able to vote in this period. Now, the idea of who is represented in these democracies in the American Revolution, American Constitution, is important as well, right? Because today we think about how the House of Representatives and the Senate are voted in by direct vote, right? We vote for the senators and the representatives. That was not the case again in 1789. Who voted in those days? You voted for your representative, but you did not vote for your senator. They were sometimes selected. They were sometimes chosen by the representative. Sometimes they were chosen by the governor, depending on where you lived. So it's important for us to it's important for us to understand, right, these ideas of checks and balances, and sort of, again, look at the sort of long arc that we are discussing. When we also look at this period, right, it's important to understand that there's a lot of different ways in which the country is continuing to grow, and the changes that are occurring during this early Republican period. One of the things to note here, right, is that Alexander Hamilton is having a big debate, and we'll talk about this again in a moment or two, with Thomas Jefferson, and the question of establishing a financial platform on which this country will emerge really was a difficult question for a lot of people to encounter. As the Articles of Confederation are dissolved and the American Constitution is established, it's important to see, right, again, in this conservative perspective, how important it was for Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, to get those wealthy folks with real buy-in, skin in the game, right? And that's where Hamilton's plan to absorb state debts from the Constitution comes in, right? Because what you do then is allow wealthy folk to purchase bonds within the government, and then becomes a way to secure their financial backing of the country. And we obviously know there's the Whiskey Rebellion, right? That happens between 1791 and 1794, which is again, certainly not democratic, right? I mean, it's against poor farmers, and the government is literally trying to suppress those poor farmers. And these ideas, right, whether it's sort of Republican, again, small R Republican, versus, these more conservative factions, right, is going to start to move towards the creation of a two-party system. And Hamilton and Jefferson are at the heart of that, right? Jefferson supports the French Revolution, and Jefferson supports looking towards, and it's often, it's basically his view of the French Revolution that gets him out of favor with George Washington. These different opinions change the way that these two groups of people interact. The description of Edmond Genet, or Citizen Genet, the French diplomat who comes to the new United States as the French Republic's emissary to the United States, is an interesting one, right? He sides with Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and he get along very well. And as he's moving about the young United States, he's going into different social clubs and societies, and he's really encouraging support for the French Revolution. And Genet, right, is in many ways started, especially among the Democratic Republican, the people who supported Thomas Jefferson. He's starting to push the bounds of American neutrality here. As people meet him and as people side with see this siding with the French cause as more and more appealing. He also, in his interactions with people, lead to many fearing the actions that these clubs are taking. They're becoming too revolutionary, too much of a question against the authority of the government to remain neutral. And that certainly becomes true in the later portions of the 1700s, right, where under the John Adams administration, the American government sends diplomats to France to meet with the French Directory's leadership, and they want to meet with Talleyrand. And under Talleyrand, Talleyrand requests the equivalent of $250,000 to speak with these French ministers. But obviously, the United States isn't going to do that, right? For these these new diplomats, right, who are meeting these old hats for the first time, the sort of old world folks for the first time, right? They don't understand that this is what had been, right? People did ask for these types of sums to negotiate and to discuss with one another. So this is not uncommon, and this is at least in European affairs, but for the United States, this is not how they thought things worked. This begins, right, the establishment of the Navy and the reestablishment of the Marines. And there is this sort of thing called a quasi-war between the French and the Americans during this period because of the hostilities that are emerging out of this XYZ affair. As we move into the later half, out of the 1800s and into the 1830s and into the 40s, we talk about a period of Jacksonian democracy, right? The expansion of democracy to others. And by the end of the 1820s and into the 1830s, there is a growing ability of people to vote, right? The vote is open up to all, a universal white male suffrage. I mean, obviously, within that, obviously by saying universal white male, right, that's still only a very small portion of the population. But it's important to notice, right, that the prohibitions against property ownership and the poll tax and the equivalencies of money to access to voting is disappearing. And it's important to see that even for the election of that Andrew Jackson that happens in the 1828 election, right? I mean, that is an important piece to note, where you have this first person being born on the west side of the Mississippi River. He's a hard scrabble guy. He's not your sort of bourgeois aristocratic member of the East Coast. He's not from Massachusetts or from Virginia. He does not have a plantation. He makes his money as a member of the army. He is a different type of person. And that changes in the 1830s and 40s, right? That we now start to view, I should say we, but it's really, in the United States, the view of Western folk, the view of or fear of aristocratic Easterners is starting to emerge within these governments. And then by the 1840s, there's new political parties. There are the Whigs and the Democrats. There is the question over the role of the government and the size of the government, something that we still hear discussed and debated in American politics today in 2021. In the 21st century are there, right? For the Whigs, this sort of the relic of those Hamiltonian Federalists start to push in, feelings of this strong government with tariffs to protect domestic industry, a national bank, public education, the American system, that is supported by people like Henry Clay, are things that are starting to emerge within this period. And again, there are all these questions that are countering that, right? Those Democratic Republicans that followed Jefferson, well, they lose the Republican and now they are just Democrats. And they are more pro-slavery, pro-states' rights. They are not strong government folk. They're typically based in the southern United States, and the Democrats in the South are going to be very strong up through the end of, up until the Civil War and after. They are very much more agrarian, and they focus on the different ways in which individual rights and individual liberties play into sort of the history of the United States. As we look and pan out over the course of the later half of the 1700s and into the early 1800s, it's important for us to be aware, right, that North and South America at this time are places that are fighting against old world conservative movements. They're, I guess, for people within the United States and the Caribbean and South America, there was a lot of feelings of, anti-old world, anti-conservative movements in this period, because there is a lot of fear over control from 3,000 miles away. And fighting against those colonial masters are important. So when you look at a place like Saint-Domingue turned Haiti, in 1794 and the revolution that will ultimately succeed in 1803 with Haiti's independence from France, that is very much an anti-conservative approach, right? I mean, you have a slave colony of 500,000 slaves and about 50,000 free people. And there's going to be massive violence overthrowing the old world leadership. Now, obviously, Haiti is a tough position because even though it's the second republic in the Western Hemisphere, it's not for another nearly 200 years until Haiti has its real first democratic election. And then certainly since then, the problems that Haiti has experienced in terms of financial distress and inequality, massive poverty, has also been a problem. The other piece to that, right, is that as Britain, France, and others are losing their connection to colonies, they are starting to give colonies a little bit more power in their own lanes. So in the 1791 Canada Act gives Canada a lot of control within their own domain. So it sets up a northern and a southern province. They have their governors that make very local decisions. A lot of those governors and a lot of the people who are in charge are emigres from the United States that have fled and shown their loyalty to the British. So I guess they had a pretty agreeable population, if you will. But it's important to notice, right, especially for people who live in Upper Canada, right, there's a big conservative bent to this, right, protection of property rights. So when we look, at in America, in the Americas, North and South, but at America in this period, right, there is a lot of ebbing and flowing over democracy and the changes to democracy within these areas. So it's important for us to understand and look at how these different types of debates are framed in the American story.